Clean the beast's cage, Omega Trash. Maybe it will finally put you out of your misery." The words hit like claws, raking across already scarred flesh. Kira felt them settle into the familiar hollow in her chest, that empty space where hope used to live before she learned better. Luna Morgana's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never doubted her own worth, each syllable dripping with the kind of disdain reserved for things too worthless to even hate properly. Kira kept her eyes down, staring at the worn stone floor of the great hall. The pack members gathered for the morning meal watched with the detached interest of wolves observing prey that was already broken, already defeated. No sport left in it. She had learned long ago that looking up only invited more cruelty, that meeting their eyes was a challenge she could never win. "Yes, Luna," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the scrape of breakfast dishes and low conversations that resumed the moment Morgana's attention moved away from her. The silver key felt heavy in her palm as Morgana dropped it without ceremony, letting it clatter against the stone before Kira could catch it. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet, and she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. 23 years old, and she had never known a moment when she belonged anywhere. She gathered the key with steady hands that had learned not to shake, at least not where others could see. The walk to the iron door that led beneath the compound felt endless, every step measured and careful. Behind her, conversation resumed in the comfortable tones of wolves who had never questioned their place in the world. The stairs descended into darkness that smelled of ancient stone and something wilder, something that made the hair on her arms stand up, even though she had made this journey every day for the past 5 years. Each step took her deeper into the bowels of Moonridge Compound, where the air grew thick with the scent of captivity and rage. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused before the massive iron bars that had held their prisoner for 127 years. Even in the dim light of the torches that burned in eternal vigilance, Fenris was magnificent and terrible. His massive form stretched nearly 8 feet from nose to tail, his silver-grey fur marked with scars that told the story of battles fought before her grandmother was born. But it was his eyes that always stopped her breath in her throat. Amber, ancient, intelligent in a way that wolves were not supposed to be intelligent. He was watching her, had been watching her from the moment her footsteps began their familiar rhythm on the stone stairs. Those golden eyes tracked her movement with an intensity that should have been frightening, would have been frightening to anyone else. The pack members who had attempted this duty before her had lasted mere hours before fleeing in terror, claiming the beast radiated malevolence that made their skin crawl. Kira had never felt that malevolence. She approached the cage with the same careful respect she showed everything else in her life, moving slowly enough that he could see her intentions. The water bucket was heavy, but she had carried heavier things. The raw meat Elder Tobias procured from the kitchens was fresh, still bloody in the way that wild things preferred. "Good morning, Fenris," she said softly, her voice taking on a gentleness it never held above ground. The great wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of his name. She was the only one who used it, the only one who had bothered to learn what he had been called in the old stories. To everyone else, he was simply the beast, the monster, the thing that lived in chains beneath their feet and reminded them why they feared the ancient times. She slid the food through the feeding slot, watching as he rose to his feet with a grace that defied his size. When he ate, it was with dignity rather than desperation, and he always waited until she had filled his water bowl before approaching the meal, as if he understood that courtesy mattered, even here in this place that had forgotten what courtesy meant. "The Alpha King arrives today," she told him as she worked, her hands steady on tasks that had become ritual. "The whole pack has been preparing for weeks. They say he's the strongest alpha born in 3 generations, that he conquered the Northern Territories before he was 25. Fenris paused in his eating, those amber eyes fixing on her face with an attention that made something flutter in her chest. She had grown accustomed to being ignored, to having her words fall on deaf ears even when she was being given orders. But Fenris listened. He always listened. The blood moon ceremony is tomorrow night. 3 packs binding themselves under one banner, or so Elder Tobias explained it to me when I brought his evening tea. She kept her voice conversational, the way she might talk to a friend if she had ever had one. They say it hasn't been done in over 50 years. The last time was when the Shadow Moon dynasty still ruled, before the wars that scattered the royal bloodline. At the mention of Shadow Moon, Fenris went completely still. The piece of meat he had been tearing fell from his jaws, forgotten. His massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as if he could sense something in the air that she could not. The intensity of his stare made her take an involuntary step back. "What is it?" she whispered, though she knew he could not answer. Above them, the sound of horns echoed through the stone, distant but unmistakable. The Alpha King had arrived. The ceremony that would reshape their world had begun. Fenris threw back his head and released a howl that seemed to come from the very depths of his ancient soul. The sound reverberated through the underground chamber, through the stone, through her bones. It was not the howl of a caged animal. It was the howl of something being called to war. The torches flickered in their brackets as if the very air trembled around them. And for one impossible moment, as that haunting cry faded into silence, Kira could have sworn she felt something stir deep in her chest. Something that had been sleeping her entire life. Something that recognized that call. The great hall had been transformed into something that transcended mortal craftsmanship, every surface gleaming with silver and moonstone that caught the light of 1,000 candles. Representatives from every major pack had arrived throughout the day, their travel-stained clothes replaced by ceremonial regalia that spoke of ancient traditions and hard-won respect. Kira stood in the Queen's chambers, surrounded by attendants who worked with reverent precision to prepare her for the most important ceremony in werewolf history. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of Shadow Moon tradition, silver silk that seemed to flow like liquid starlight, embroidered with symbols that told the story of her bloodline in threads of pure gold. The northern packs have sent their finest warriors as honour guard, Elder Tobias reported, his weathered face bright with excitement. The Eastern Territories dispatched their most skilled crafters with gifts of unprecedented value. Even the southern coastal packs, who haven't acknowledged royal authority in over 2 centuries, have sent delegations. Through the tall windows, she could see the compound courtyard filled with wolves from every corner of the continent. Banners flew in colours she had only read about in ancient texts, representing bloodlines that traced their heritage back to the founding of werewolf civilization itself. "They're here to witness the birth of an empire," she said, understanding the true magnitude of what they were undertaking. This wasn't just a wedding between 2 individuals, but the formal unification of territories that would reshape their entire world. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, followed by the entrance of someone she hadn't expected to see. A woman, perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair and eyes the same shade of amber as Fenris. She wore the simple robes of a travelling scholar, but something about her presence made every instinct in Kira's body come to attention. "Your Majesty," the woman said, dropping into a curtsy that somehow managed to convey respect without subservience. "I am Elena Moonwright, keeper of the Shadow Moon ancestral records. I have something that belongs to you." Elena. The name hit Kira like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of half-remembered sensations. Strong arms holding her close, a woman's voice singing lullabies, the scent of moonflowers and desperate love. "You're alive!" Kira whispered, her voice breaking with emotion she couldn't contain. "They told me you were dead. They said you were tortured, that you never revealed where you hid me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer, her weathered hands reaching out to cup Kira's face with the same reverence she might show a sacred relic. I was tortured, little star. I did almost die. But love is stronger than pain, and I had a promise to keep. The pet name sent warmth flooding through Kira's chest as memories clicked into place with perfect clarity. This was the woman who had raised her for the first months of her life, who had sung her to sleep with lullabies in the old tongue, who had loved her with the fierce devotion of someone who understood exactly what she was protecting. "I have watched you from the shadows for 23 years, Elena continued, her voice thick with emotion. I have seen you survive cruelty that would have broken lesser souls. I have watched you grow into the queen your mother always knew you would become." From the folds of her robes, she withdrew a necklace that made Kira's breath catch in her throat. The pendant was silver, wrought in the shape of a howling wolf, surrounded by a crown of stars that seemed to move and shift in the candlelight. But it was the chain that held her attention, delicate links that had been crafted by hands that understood beauty as a form of worship. "Your mother's wedding necklace," Elena said reverently. "Queen Leanna wore this when she married your father, as her mother wore it before her and her mother before that. It has been passed down through 40 generations of Shadow Moon queens, and now it passes to you." Kira's hands trembled as Elena fastened the necklace around her throat, the silver warming against her skin as if it recognized the royal blood that flowed through her veins. In the mirror, she could see herself transformed, not just by the gown and jewellery, but by the weight of history that settled around her like a mantle. "She would be so proud," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of celebration echoing from the great hall. "Your mother dreamed of the day when you would claim your birthright and unite the packs under wise leadership. She died believing that dream would never come to pass." "It will come to pass tonight," Kira replied, her voice steady with certainty that surprised them both. "Not just through marriage, but through the choice to build something better than what came before." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the werewolf world had witnessed in living memory. As Kira walked down the great hall's centre aisle, every representative present rose to their feet in acknowledgement of royal authority that could not be denied or questioned. But it was Darius who held her attention, magnificent in ceremonial robes of midnight blue that emphasized his powerful frame and pale eyes. Fenris walked beside her as ceremonial guardian, his massive form moving with dignified grace that spoke of ancient protocols and sacred duties. The legendary beast had been bathed and groomed until his silver-grey fur gleamed like polished metal, and around his neck he wore a collar of moonstone that marked him as protector of the royal bloodline. The vows they exchanged were older than written language, spoken in the tongue that predated human civilization and called upon powers that governed the turning of seasons and the movement of stars. But when the formal words ended, Darius spoke from his heart in the common language that every wolf present could understand. "I take you not just as mate, but as partner," he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the packed hall. "I offer you not just my love, but my strength, my loyalty, my absolute devotion to the empire we will build together." "And I take you not just as husband, but as equal," Kira replied, silver light beginning to dance around them both as their bond reached toward completion. "I offer you not just my heart, but my power, my wisdom, my solemn oath to rule with justice and compassion." The moment their hands joined, golden light erupted from Darius to merge with her silver radiance, creating something that was neither but both, a fusion of royal bloodlines that sent every wolf present to their knees in involuntary submission. The mate bond that snapped into place between them was like nothing either had experienced before. Not just the supernatural connection that linked werewolf pairs, but something deeper, more complex, the joining of two souls that had been shaped by responsibility and tempered by loss, coming together to create a partnership that would reshape their world. "Behold!" Elder Tobias called out, his voice cracking with emotion as he witnessed prophecies fulfilled. Queen Kira of Shadow Moon and King Darius of the Northern Territories, united in bond and blood, joint rulers of the first werewolf empire in 5 centuries. The roar that erupted from the assembled crowd shook dust from the ancient rafters and sent birds fleeing from the compound walls. Howls of joy and recognition rose from every throat as wolves who had spent lifetimes fighting territorial wars witnessed the dawn of a new age. But it was the moment when Fenris approached their joined hands and placed his massive head against their intertwined fingers that sealed their triumph completely. The ancient guardian's approval blazed through the mate bond, carrying with it the blessing of every Shadow Moon Queen who had ever ruled. As the celebration continued around them, Kira looked out over the sea of faces turned toward her with hope and expectation. Representatives of bloodlines that had warred for centuries now knelt together in acknowledgement of unified authority. "So," she murmured to her husband, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear, "how does it feel to rule an empire, Your Majesty?" His answering smile was sharp enough to cut starlight. "Ask me again in 100 years, my queen. I have a feeling we're just getting started." 6 months had transformed the werewolf world in ways that would have seemed impossible when Kira still scrubbed floors in Moonridge Compound. From the royal balcony of their newly constructed palace, she could see the fruits of unified leadership spreading across the landscape like ripples in still water. The morning sun caught the silver banners that flew from every watchtower, each one bearing the merged symbols of Shadow Moon and Northern Territories. Where once there had been border fortifications designed to keep packs separated, now there were trading posts and healing centres that served wolves from every bloodline without distinction. "The Eastern Coastal Delegation has agreed to the infrastructure project," Darius reported, joining her at the carved stone railing that overlooked their thriving capital. His hair was tousled from their morning council meeting, but his pale blue eyes blazed with the satisfaction of someone watching impossible dreams become reality. "Roads connecting all major pack territories with way stations every 50 miles for travellers and messengers," she said, reviewing the proposal they had been negotiating for weeks. "It will take 5 years to complete, but when it's finished, a wolf will be able to travel from the northern icefields to the southern marshlands in perfect safety," he completed, his arms sliding around her waist with the easy intimacy of true partners. "Trade routes that will make every pack prosper, communication networks that will prevent the isolation that breeds conflict." Below them, the courtyard bustled with activity that would have been unthinkable during the old territorial system. Northern craftsmen worked alongside Eastern artisans to create buildings that combined the best of both traditions. Southern healers shared knowledge with Western scholars, their different approaches to medicine creating innovations that benefited everyone. But it was the children that made Kira's heart sing with hope. Young wolves from dozens of different bloodlines played together without regard for the boundaries that had once defined their parents' worlds. They spoke the common tongue with accents that reflected their diverse heritage, but they also learned the old language in classes taught by Elder Tobias and his expanding network of teachers. "Fenris has been restless lately," she mentioned, watching the legendary guardian emerge from the forest that bordered their palace grounds. Even at this distance, his massive form was unmistakable, silver-grey fur gleaming in the morning light as he padded through gardens that had been designed specifically to accommodate his size. "He senses it too," Darius said, his hand moving to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "Ancient magic recognizes what grows within you, even before mortal senses can detect it." The pregnancy was barely 2 weeks confirmed, but already she could feel the difference in how power flowed through her body. Not diminished as she had feared, but changed, becoming something richer and more complex. The royal bloodline that blazed in her veins now carried the promise of the next generation, heirs who would inherit an empire built on justice rather than conquest. Twins, she said, sharing the news that had arrived with the healer's dawn visit. Just like my brothers were twins. His sharp intake of breath told her everything she needed to know about how that revelation affected him. Marcus and Damien had been legends in their own right, princes who had shown promise of becoming the kind of leaders who changed history. That their children might follow that same pattern felt like a blessing from the ancestors themselves. Two little wolves who will grow up in a world where pack loyalty and royal authority work together instead of against each other, Darius said, wonder colouring his deep voice. Two heirs who will never know what it feels like to be powerless or unwanted. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 23 years believing herself worthless while carrying within her bloodline the power to reshape civilization itself. Now her children would be born, knowing exactly who they were and what they represented, raised with love and wisdom instead of cruelty and suppression. Fenris appeared on the balcony with the silent grace that always surprised people who expected such a massive creature to make noise. His amber eyes fixed immediately on her midsection, and the rumble that emerged from his chest sounded remarkably like a purr of satisfaction. "He knows," she said, reaching out to stroke the thick fur behind his ears. "Ancient guardians are connected to royal bloodlines in ways that go beyond simple loyalty." The great beast leaned into her touch with obvious contentment, but his attention remained focused on the new life that grew within her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of prophecies fulfilled and futures secured. The bloodline continues. The compact between Shadow Moon royalty and the Guardian line extends to the next generation. I will protect these cubs as I have protected their mother, with my life and beyond. It was a vow that sent warmth flooding through her chest, though she hoped it would never be necessary. The world they were building was meant to be one where children could grow up safe from the kind of violence that had shaped her early years. "The Southern Territories have requested a formal audience next month," Darius mentioned, pulling her attention back to the political realities that still required careful navigation. "They want to discuss joining the Empire officially rather than maintaining their current alliance status. That would make them the last major werewolf territory to fully integrate, bringing under unified rule lands that stretch from Arctic tundra to subtropical swamplands. It was the dream that had sustained her mother through the darkest days before the massacre, the vision of a werewolf nation strong enough to preserve their species against any threat. "We'll need to be careful about the terms," she said, her mind already working through the diplomatic complexities involved. "The Southern Pacts value their autonomy highly. They'll want guarantees that joining the Empire won't mean losing their cultural identity." "Cultural preservation with political unity," Darius agreed. "Let them keep their traditions and local governance while agreeing to imperial law for major crimes and territorial disputes." It was the approach that had worked with every other integration, respecting the diversity that made their species strong while establishing the framework necessary for lasting peace. Not the homogenization that previous empires had attempted, but true unity built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As afternoon melted into evening, they stood together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The palace around them hummed with activity as servants prepared for the evening meal, but this moment belonged to them alone. "Do you ever miss it?" Darius asked quietly. "The simplicity of not being responsible for an entire civilization?" Kira considered the question seriously, thinking back to the girl who had cleaned cages and endured mockery without believing she deserved better. There had been a certain peace in having no expectations, no duties beyond survival. "No," she said finally, certainty ringing in her voice. "I miss the innocence sometimes, the ability to believe that someone else would handle the difficult decisions. But I don't miss being powerless. I don't miss watching injustice happen and being unable to stop it." Her hand moved to rest over her stomach, where two tiny lives grew with each passing day. "These cubs will be born into a world where strength serves justice instead of the other way around, where being different doesn't make you worthless, where love and loyalty can coexist with authority and power. "The golden age our ancestors dreamed about," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "The golden age we built together," she corrected, turning to face him fully, not through conquest or intimidation, but through the simple revolutionary idea that everyone deserves to be safe, fed, and valued. As if summoned by her words, Fenris raised his massive head and released a howl that carried across their lands with perfect clarity. Not a call to war or warning of danger, but pure joy, the sound of contentment that came from knowing the future was secure. From every corner of their empire, answering howls rose to join his song, thousands of voices blending into a harmony that spoke of unity freely chosen rather than forced. The sound washed over them like a benediction, the voice of a people who had found their way home at last. The silver moon hung full and radiant above the royal palace as Queen Kira's labour pains began with the first toll of midnight. Ancient magic had always tied royal births to celestial events, and tonight the very stars seemed to pause in their eternal dance to witness the arrival of the next generation of Shadow Moon heirs. Darius paced the antechamber like a caged wolf, his usual composure shattered by forces beyond his control. Through the thick oak doors he could hear the sounds of activity as the realm's finest healers attended to his wife, but centuries of royal protocol prevented him from entering until the births were complete. "The bloodline chooses its own timing," Elder Tobias said gently, though his weathered hands trembled with excitement as he consulted ancient texts that described the signs and portents of royal births. "Your cubs will arrive when the moon reaches its apex, just as Shadow Moon heirs have done for 40 generations. Through the palace, every wolf-born creature had gathered in silent vigil. Servants and nobles, warriors and scholars, all united in their anticipation of meeting the princes who would one day inherit an empire built on justice and love. Even the livestock in the distant fields had gone quiet, as if nature itself held its breath. Fenris lay sprawled across the corridor outside the birthing chamber, his massive form blocking access to anyone who might disturb the sacred process. His amber eyes remained fixed on the doors, every muscle in his legendary frame tensed with protective instinct that had been bred into his bloodline for millennia. The cry that pierced the midnight air was not one of pain but of triumph, followed immediately by a second voice that harmonized with the first in perfect accord. The twin princes of Shadow Moon had arrived, and their combined howls sent silver light cascading through the palace walls like captured starlight made manifest. "Your Majesty," the head healer called, her voice bright with wonder and exhaustion, "you may come meet your sons." Darius burst through the doors with barely restrained emotion, his pale blue eyes immediately finding Kira, where she reclined against silk pillows that seemed inadequate for someone who had just accomplished the impossible. She looked radiant despite her exhaustion, silver light still dancing around her skin as royal power celebrated the successful continuation of the bloodline. In her arms she held 2 perfect cubs whose eyes blazed with intelligence that seemed far too ancient for newborns. One had inherited her silver eyes, while the other showed Darius's pale blue, but both carried the unmistakable presence of wolves who would grow up to reshape the world. "Prince Adrian," she said softly, indicating the cub with silver eyes who seemed to be studying his father with intense curiosity. "And Prince Marcus, named for your beta and my lost brother." The blue-eyed cub made a sound that was remarkably like approval, as if he understood the honour of carrying a name that connected him to both his father's trusted friend and his mother's murdered sibling. "They're magnificent," Darius whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he reached out to stroke tiny fingers that instinctively curled around his larger ones. "I can feel their power already. They're going to be stronger than either of us ever imagined." As if summoned by the wonder in his voice, Fenris appeared in the doorway with silent grace. The ancient guardian approached the bed with reverent steps, his massive head lowering until he could examine the new princes with eyes that had witnessed the birth of 6 previous generations of Shadow Moon royalty. The cubs showed no fear of the legendary beast, their tiny hands reaching toward him with the fearless curiosity of those who recognized a protector. When Fenris allowed them to touch his scarred muzzle, silver and gold light flickered between them, sealing bonds that would last for centuries to come. "They will be great leaders," Fenris rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Prince Adrian has the gift of sight, the ability to see truth through deception. Prince Marcus carries the warrior's heart, strength tempered by justice. Together, they will guide your empire into an age of prosperity that will be remembered for 1,000 years." The words settled over the birthing chamber like a benediction, carrying with them the promise of a future brighter than any of them had dared to imagine. Over the months that followed, the royal family settled into rhythms of love and governance that seemed to flow as naturally as breathing. The princes grew with supernatural swiftness, their royal bloodline manifesting in ways that delighted everyone who witnessed their development. Prince Adrian's gift for seeing truth revealed itself early, his silver eyes detecting deception in even the most skilled diplomats who came to court. He would tilt his head and study visitors with unnerving intensity, then whisper observations to his mother that often proved startlingly accurate. Prince Marcus showed his warrior heritage in the way he moved, even as an infant displaying the kind of physical coordination that spoke of future greatness in battle. But it was his gentleness with smaller creatures that marked him as his mother's son, his strength always employed in protection rather than domination. On a crisp autumn evening, as the first snow of winter dusted the palace battlements, Kira stood on the royal balcony holding her sons, while Darius's strong arms encircled them all. Below them, their empire stretched to the horizon, lights twinkling in settlements that represented every major werewolf bloodline. "Look at what we built," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder that never seemed to fade. "Look at what love accomplished." The journey from worthless Omega to beloved Queen felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story she had heard rather than lived. But the warmth of her family around her, the weight of her sons in her arms, the steady heartbeat of the man who had seen her worth when no one else could, these were the realities that mattered. "I used to think strength meant the ability to endure cruelty without breaking," she continued, watching her son's eyes track the movement of snowflakes beyond the window. "But real strength is the courage to believe you deserve better, even when the entire world tells you otherwise." Darius pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, his voice warm with the kind of love that had transformed them both. "And wisdom is knowing that worth isn't something you earn through suffering. It's something you possess simply by existing, something that no one else has the right to define or diminish." Prince Adrian made a soft sound that might have been agreement, his silver eyes finding his mother's face with the kind of recognition that suggested he understood far more than should be possible for someone so young. Prince Marcus curled closer to the warmth of her body, already showing the protective instincts that would one day make him a formidable guardian of their people. "When I was cleaning Fenris's cage and dreaming of nothing more than a day without cruelty, I never imagined this," Kira said, her voice soft with remembered pain and present joy. "I never imagined that the girl who thought herself nobody could become someone capable of love this profound." "You were always capable of it," Darius replied, his pale eyes reflecting the silver light that still danced around her when emotion ran high. The capacity for love was never the question. The question was whether you would find people worthy of receiving it. Below them, Fenris emerged from the forest that bordered their palace, his evening patrol complete. Even at this distance, they could see his amber eyes turn toward the royal balcony, checking on the family he had sworn to protect. When he saw them safe and together, his massive tail wagged once in satisfaction before he settled into his preferred resting spot beneath the ancient oak that had been planted in memory of Queen Leanna. The cycles continue, Kira mused, watching the guardian take up his eternal vigil. Love, protection, sacrifice, hope, each generation passing wisdom to the next, building something larger and more beautiful than what came before. The snow continued to fall as they stood together in comfortable silence, four souls united by bonds that transcended politics or bloodlines. In the distance, lights flickered in windows where families gathered around warm fires, secure in the knowledge that their rulers valued compassion over conquest, justice over revenge. "I love you," Darius said quietly, the words carrying the weight of vows renewed with each passing day. "And I love you," she replied, silver light pulsing gently around them like a heartbeat made visible. "All of you, this family, this empire, this impossible dream that became our reality." Prince Adrian's tiny hand closed around his father's finger, while Prince Marcus nestled deeper into his mother's warmth, both cubs already showing the kind of contentment that came from being absolutely certain of their place in the world. They would grow up knowing they were loved, valued, and destined for greatness, not because of their bloodline, but because of the character their parents would help them build. As the midnight bells chimed across their empire, marking another day in the golden age they had created together, Queen Kira of Shadowmoon understood that her greatest victory was not the crown she wore or the power she wielded, but the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over hatred, hope over despair, and building over destroying. The girl who had once believed herself worthless had become a woman who knew beyond any doubt that every soul possessed value beyond measure. And in teaching her sons that truth, she ensured that the light of that wisdom would shine for generations yet to come. The ground trembled beneath the hoofbeats of 50 horses, their riders cloaked in the deep black leather that marked them as the Alpha King's elite guard. Kira pressed herself against the kitchen window, watching through smudged glass as the most powerful werewolf in the Northern Territories made his entrance into Moonridge compound. Alpha King Darius Blackthorn rode at the head of his procession on a massive black stallion that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even at this distance, even through the barrier of stone walls and social hierarchy, Kira could feel the overwhelming presence that preceded him like a physical force. Her wolf, the pathetic creature that had never once responded to her call, stirred restlessly beneath her skin for the first time in years. The pack members who had been preparing the great hall all morning now lined the courtyard in perfect formation, their heads bowed in submission before he had even dismounted. Luna Morgana stood at their centre, resplendent in ceremonial robes of deep blue that emphasized her auburn hair and perfect features. She was everything an alpha female should be, beautiful, powerful, commanding, everything Kira was not. "Stop gawking and help me with these platters," Cook Martha snapped, though her tone held less venom than usual. Even she seemed affected by the electricity in the air, the sense that something momentous was about to unfold. "You'll be serving tonight, Omega, so try not to embarrass us more than usual." Kira's hands stilled on the silver serving tray she had been polishing. "Serving? But I never served the formal dinners." "Luna's orders said we need every hand tonight, even worthless ones." Martha's weathered face creased into something that might have been sympathy on anyone else. "Mind yourself, girl. Alpha King or not, he won't protect you if you give them reason to notice you." The hours that followed passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. Kira found herself dressed in the plain grey dress reserved for serving Omegas, her dark hair braided back severely to keep it from her face. In the polished surface of the serving platters, she caught glimpses of herself and saw what everyone else saw: unremarkable features, too pale skin, the hollow look of someone who had learned not to hope for better treatment. As evening approached, she made her way through the compound's corridors toward the great hall, her arms laden with wine pitchers that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The sounds of laughter and conversation spilled out from behind the massive oak doors, punctuated by the deep rumble of male voices that made her wolf pace restlessly. She paused at the servants' entrance, gathering courage that felt as insubstantial as morning mist. Through the crack in the door, she could see the assembled pack leadership seated at the high table, their finest clothes and ceremonial jewellery catching the light from hundreds of candles. And at the centre of it all, commanding attention even in silence, sat Alpha King Darius. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 at most, with black hair that caught the candlelight and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of 3 territories. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath in her throat, pale blue, like winter ice, and sharp with an intelligence that seemed to cut through pretense and see straight to the truth of things. Taking a steadying breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Kira slipped through the servants' entrance and began making her way along the walls of the great hall. The wine pitchers felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands, and she focused on placing one foot in front of the other, on becoming invisible the way she had learned to do. She was halfway across the hall when it happened. Those pale blue eyes found her across the crowded room, tracking her movement with the same intensity Fenris showed when she descended to his chamber. The wine pitcher in her right hand slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, crashing to the stone floor in an explosion of ceramic shards and dark red wine that looked too much like blood in the candlelight. The conversation stopped. Every head in the hall turned toward the commotion, toward her, and Kira felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her cheeks. She dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to gather the broken pieces with hands that shook so badly she could barely grasp the fragments. "Clumsy Omega!" Luna Morgana's voice cut through the silence like a blade, her perfect features twisted with embarrassment and rage. "I should have known better than to trust you with something important." "I'm sorry," Kira whispered, her voice barely audible above the blood pounding in her ears. "I'm so sorry, Luna. Please, I'll clean it up." "You'll clean it up with your tongue if I say so," Morgana snarled, rising from her seat with fluid grace. The assembled pack members watched with the fascinated horror of wolves scenting blood in the water. "On your hands and knees, Omega. Show our distinguished guest what happens to those who can't perform the simplest tasks." Kira's hands stilled on the broken ceramic, shame burning through her veins like acid. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her humiliation, could hear the barely suppressed chuckles from pack members who had always found entertainment in her suffering. But worst of all, she could feel those pale blue eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel too small for her body. She lowered her head toward the wine-stained floor, prepared to endure whatever would come next. It was easier than fighting back. Fighting back only made things worse. The sound of a chair scraping against stone made her freeze. Heavy footsteps approached across the hall, and she caught the scent of something wild and powerful, like pine forests and winter storms. A pair of black boots appeared in her vision, just at the edge of the spreading wine stain. "That's enough." The voice was deep, carrying an authority that made every wolf in the room sit up straighter. Alpha King Darius spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had never had his commands questioned. "She's cleaned up enough." "Alpha King." Morgana's voice held a note of panic beneath its attempted charm. "Please, don't let this Omega's clumsiness reflect on our pack's hospitality. She's been serving wine to a room full of people while maintaining perfect control until one moment of accident." His words were measured, careful, but Kira could hear something beneath them that sounded dangerously like anger. "Hardly worthy of the punishment you were about to inflict." A large hand appeared in her field of vision, palm up, offered without expectation. Kira stared at it for a long moment, unable to process what she was seeing. No one helped her. No one ever helped her. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, she placed her wine-stained fingers in his palm. His skin was warm, calloused from weapons and hard work, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt something electric shoot up her arm. His eyes widened slightly, as if he had felt it too, that impossible spark of connection that made no sense. He pulled her to her feet with gentle strength, steadying her when she swayed. This close, she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, could smell the wild scent of him that made her wolf whine with longing. For one impossible moment, the entire world narrowed to the warmth of his hand holding hers, and the way he looked at her, as if she mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly before he released her hand and stepped back. The loss of contact felt like a physical blow, leaving her bereft in a way she didn't understand. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall, "it would be better if the serving staff were allowed to focus on their duties without fear of excessive punishment for minor accidents." It was not quite a rebuke, but every wolf present understood the message. Luna Morgana's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup, and she sank into a curtsy that couldn't quite hide the fury burning in her green eyes. "Of course, Alpha King, you are most gracious." Kira gathered the remaining ceramic shards with hands that no longer shook, acutely aware of the silence that surrounded her every movement. When she finally escaped to the kitchens, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Cook Martha took one look at her face and pressed a cup of cold water into her hands. "Drink," she ordered, her voice unusually gentle. "And then get yourself down to the cellars. Check on that beast of yours. He's been making a racket for the past hour, howling fit to wake the dead." Kira nodded mutely, grateful for the excuse to escape. As she made her way toward the iron door that led to Fenris's prison, she could still feel the phantom warmth of the Alpha King's hand in hers, could still see the way his eyes had widened when their skin touched. Behind her, the sounds of the feast resumed, but they seemed muted now, distant, as if something fundamental had shifted in the world, leaving everything slightly off balance. In the depths below, Fenris paced his cage with frantic energy, his amber eyes wild with something that looked almost like anticipation. When he saw her descending the stairs, he pressed himself against the bars with desperate intensity, as if he could somehow push through the silver-reinforced iron through will alone. "I know," she whispered, settling onto the stone floor just out of reach of his massive paws. "I felt it too." For the first time in her life, Kira wondered if there might be more to her existence than enduring until the next day. The thought terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. The blood moon rose like an ancient wound against the star-scattered sky, its crimson light casting everything in shades of prophecy and war. From her position in the kitchens, banished from the ceremony she was deemed too lowly to witness, Kira could hear the ritual chanting that had begun at the stroke of midnight. The voices of 3 pack alphas rose and fell in the ancient words, syllables that predated written language and called upon powers older than civilization itself. "Alpha King." Darius's voice dominated the chorus, his words carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the compound. Beside him, Luna Morgana and Alpha Garrett of the Eastern Peaks wove their voices into the binding spell that would unite their territories under one banner for the first time in living memory. Kira's hands trembled as she scrubbed the same plate for the 3rd time, unable to focus on the mundane task, while something wild and desperate clawed at her insides. Her wolf, silent and submissive for 23 years, paced beneath her skin with frantic energy. Every word of the ceremony seemed to call to something deep in her bones, something that had been sleeping so long she had forgotten it existed. The compulsion struck like lightning, sudden and undeniable. She had to go to Fenris, now. She dropped the plate into the washing basin without caring that Cook Martha glared at her with disapproval. Her feet carried her through the corridors as if someone else controlled them, past the great hall where the ceremony reached its crescendo, down the stone steps into the bowels of the compound where shadows danced in the flickering torchlight. The underground chamber thrummed with a tension that had nothing to do with the ritual above. Fenris stood pressed against the bars of his cage, every muscle in his massive frame coiled like a spring ready to snap. His amber eyes blazed with a fury she had never seen before, and the silver chains that had held him for over a century groaned under the strain of his struggles. "Fenris," she whispered, approaching the cage with the same careful respect she always showed him. "What's wrong?" He threw back his head and released a howl that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, a sound so filled with rage and longing that it made the torches gutter in their brackets. The very walls seemed to vibrate with the force of it, and Kira felt something in her chest respond, an answering call that she didn't understand. Above them, the ceremony reached its climactic moment. The three voices joined together in perfect harmony, sealing the ancient pact with words that carried the weight of destiny. Alpha King. Darius's voice rose above the others, strong and commanding, as he spoke the final binding that would make him not just king of the Northern Territories, but sovereign over all three allied pacts. The moment the last word left his lips, something snapped. The sound was like thunder, like the world itself cracking open. The silver chains that had bound Fenris for 127 years shattered as if they were made of glass. Links of blessed metal flew in every direction, ringing against the stone walls like funeral bells. Fenris stood in the ruins of his prison, magnificent and terrible, his silver-grey fur seeming to glow with its own inner light. He was massive, far larger than any wolf had a right to be, with scars that told the story of battles fought before the oldest living pack member had been born. But it was his eyes that held Kira frozen in place. They burned with an intelligence that was utterly, impossibly human. For one perfect moment, they stared at each other across the shattered remains of his cage. Then Fenris stepped through the twisted bars as if they were no obstacle at all, moving with the fluid grace of something that had never truly been caged, only waiting. The screaming started above them as the pack sensed their ancient prisoner's freedom. Footsteps thundered across the great hall, voices shouted orders and warnings, but none of it seemed to matter. The world had narrowed to this underground chamber, to the space between her and the beast that approached her with deliberate, measured steps. Kira should have run. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to flee, to get as far away from the legendary creature as possible. But her feet remained rooted to the stone floor, and her heart hammered against her ribs with something that was not quite fear. Fenris stopped just an arm's length away, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his massive form. His amber eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see straight through to her soul and was searching for something specific. Above them, the great hall doors burst open. Heavy boots pounded down the stone stairs, accompanied by the scrape of drawn weapons and the sharp scent of fear sweat. Alpha King Darius's voice cut through the chaos, commanding and controlled even in crisis. "Surround the beast! Do not let it reach the upper levels!" The torch flames flickered wildly as armed pack members flooded into the chamber, their silver weapons gleaming in the dancing light. Luna Morgana appeared at the Alpha King's shoulder, her ceremonial robes torn and her perfect hair dishevelled, her green eyes wide with terror and rage. "Kill it!" she screamed, pointing at Fenris with a shaking hand. "Kill it before it destroys everything!" Fenris didn't even glance at the armed wolves surrounding him. His attention remained fixed on Kira's face, those ancient eyes searching for something she didn't understand. The pack members formed a loose circle around them, weapons raised but none daring to make the first move against a creature of legend. Alpha King Darius stepped into the circle, a silver sword in his right hand that caught the torchlight like captured stars. His pale blue eyes swept the scene, taking in Fenris's calm demeanour, Kira's strange stillness, the shattered chains that had supposedly been unbreakable. "Step away from him," he commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. But there was something in his tone, something that sounded almost like concern rather than authority. "Slowly, don't make any sudden movements." Kira opened her mouth to obey, to back away from the creature that every rational part of her mind recognized as deadly. But before she could move, before she could speak, Fenris did something that stopped every heart in the chamber. He lowered his massive head in a gesture of perfect, unmistakable submission. Not to Alpha King Darius, whose royal blood commanded the loyalty of every wolf-born creature in the known territories. Not to Luna Morgana, whose alpha authority should have compelled his obedience. To her. To Kira, the worthless Omega who cleaned his cage and brought him scraps of meat like offerings to a forgotten god. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed, no one moved. The very air seemed frozen in shock at the impossibility of what they had all witnessed. Fenris, the legendary beast who had killed dozens of warriors in the wars that ended the Shadow Moon dynasty, who had been deemed too dangerous to execute and too valuable to destroy, had just acknowledged a nobody as his superior. Luna Morgana's face went white with rage and disbelief. "Impossible," she whispered, her voice hoarse with denial. "It's some kind of trick. She's used dark magic to corrupt the beast's mind." But Alpha King Darius lowered his sword, his pale eyes fixed on the scene before him with an expression that was impossible to read. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that made everyone present lean forward to catch his words. "No," he said quietly, as if speaking to himself rather than the assembled pack. "Not corruption, recognition." Kira reached out with trembling fingers, hardly daring to believe what her eyes showed her. Fenris remained perfectly still as her palm came to rest on the top of his massive head, his fur softer than she had imagined beneath her touch. The moment their skin made contact, silver light flickered across both their forms, brief but unmistakable. The pack members fell back a step, weapons wavering in suddenly uncertain hands. Even Luna Morgana's rage faltered in the face of something that defied explanation. In that moment of perfect quiet, with her hand resting on the head of the ancient beast and silver light dancing between them like captured starlight, Kira felt something stir in the deepest part of her soul. Something that had been locked away so long she had forgotten its existence. Something that whispered, in a voice like distant thunder, that she had never been nobody at all. The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations and barely concealed stares that followed Kira wherever she walked. The pack members who had once dismissed her as invisible now watched her with a mixture of fear and fascination, as if she had transformed from harmless pest into something potentially dangerous overnight. She had been moved from the servants' quarters to a guest room in the main compound, a space with actual windows and a bed that didn't sag in the middle. The luxury felt wrong against her skin, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. But Alpha King Darius had been clear in his commands. She was under royal protection until the truth of what had happened could be determined. Fenris had been returned to his chamber, but the silver chains lay in pieces on the stone floor like broken promises. New restraints had been forged, stronger ones blessed by the pack's eldest shaman, but everyone understood they were merely symbols now. The ancient beast remained in his cage because he chose to, not because any force could compel him. Kira descended the familiar stone steps with careful precision, carrying fresh meat and water as she had every day for 5 years. But nothing felt familiar anymore. The very air seemed different, charged with possibilities that made her skin prickle with nervous energy. Fenris waited for her at the bars, amber eyes tracking her every movement with that unsettling intelligence. When she approached his cage, he pressed his massive snout against the iron bars, close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her palm. I don't understand what happened, she whispered, settling into her usual spot just out of reach of his paws. Everyone keeps staring at me like I've grown a second head. Luna Morgana looks at me like she wants to rip my throat out with her bare hands. A low rumble emerged from Fenris's chest, not quite a growl, but something deeper, more complex, almost like he was trying to speak to her in a language she had forgotten how to hear. The Alpha King keeps asking to see me, she continued, absently running her fingers along the stone floor where his chains had once rested. His beta, Marcus, came by 3 times yesterday, each time with more questions I can't answer. What did you feel? How long have you been able to calm the beast? Have you ever experienced anything like this before? The truth was, she had never experienced anything like the silver light that had danced between them, the moment of perfect connection when her hand touched his fur. But something about that moment had felt less like discovery and more like remembering, like waking up from a dream she hadn't realized she was having. Heavy footsteps on the stone stairs made her tense. She recognized that measured tread, the way each step seemed to carry the weight of absolute authority. Alpha King Darius appeared at the bottom of the staircase, his pale blue eyes adjusting to the torchlit gloom with predatory efficiency. He had changed from his ceremonial robes into simple leather and wool, but somehow the casual clothes only emphasized the raw power that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. His dark hair was tousled as if he had been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his deep voice echoing off the stone walls. "You come to see him every day." Kira scrambled to her feet, automatically dropping into the submissive posture she had been taught from childhood. "Alpha King, I was just bringing his meal, as ordered. I didn't mean to—" "Stop!" The command was gentle but absolute, and she found herself freezing mid-sentence. "You don't have to submit to me, not any more." The words made no sense. Everyone submitted to the Alpha King. It was the natural order of things, as fundamental as gravity or the turning of seasons. But when she dared to lift her eyes to his face, she saw something there that made her chest tighten with confusion. He was looking at her the same way Fenris did, as if he could see something in her that she couldn't see in herself. "I need to ask you some questions," he said, moving closer with the careful control of someone approaching a skittish animal. "About your family, your history, what you remember from before you came to Moonridge." Kira's throat felt suddenly dry. "There's nothing to remember, Alpha King. I was brought here as an infant. Luna Morgana told me my parents died in a rogue attack, that the pack took me in out of mercy." Something flickered in his pale eyes, gone too quickly for her to identify. "And you've never questioned that story? Never wondered why an Omega child would be kept alive when resources were scarce?" The question hit like a physical blow. She had wondered in the dark hours of the night when sleep eluded her, and the cruelty of the day replayed itself in endless loops. Why keep a mouth that couldn't contribute? Why waste resources on someone who would never be strong enough to defend the pack? "I assumed," she said carefully, "that Luna Morgana has a generous heart." The sound that escaped him might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. Luna Morgana has never done anything generous in her life without expecting payment in return. Behind the bars, Fenris had gone completely still, those amber eyes fixed on the Alpha King with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The ancient beast's attention felt like a third presence in the chamber, weighing and measuring everything that passed between them. "There are things about you that don't make sense," Darius continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. "The way you move through the compound like you're trying not to be seen, but also like you know every stone, every shadow, the way the beast responds to you, the way my wolf responds to you." Heat flooded her cheeks at the last words, and she took an involuntary step backward. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" He moved closer, and she caught his scent again, that wild combination of pine forests and winter storms that made her own wolf whine with longing. When I touched your hand in the great hall, you felt it too, that spark of recognition, that sense of something clicking into place. She wanted to deny it, to retreat into the safety of being nobody special, but the truth burned in her chest like swallowed fire, impossible to ignore. She had felt it. She felt it now, standing so close to him that she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. "I don't understand what's happening to me," she whispered, the admission torn from her throat like a confession. His expression softened, and for a moment he looked less like the terrifying Alpha King and more like a man struggling with forces beyond his control. "That makes two of us, but I intend to find out." He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a small silver pendant, tarnished with age but unmistakably crafted by master hands. The design was intricate, showing a crescent moon surrounded by stars, and something about it made her breath catch in her throat. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, holding it up so the torchlight caught the delicate metalwork. Kira stared at the pendant, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should say no. She should shake her head and maintain the safe fiction that she was exactly who Luna Morgana had told her she was. But looking at that silver crescent, she felt the same stirring in her chest that had awakened when Fenris bowed to her. She started, then stopped, started again. "I think I've seen it before. In dreams, maybe." His eyes sharpened. What kind of dreams? Running through forests under starlight, being carried by someone who smelled like moonflowers and safety, a woman's voice singing lullabies in a language I don't recognize. The words spilled out of her before she could stop them, memories she had dismissed as childhood fantasies, suddenly feeling precious and real. "But that's impossible. I was just a baby when my parents died." Darius stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a verdict that would change everything. "What if I told you that your parents didn't die in a rogue attack? What if I told you they were murdered for who they were, and you were hidden to protect you from the same fate?" The world seemed to tilt sideways. Kira reached out blindly, her hand finding the cold stone wall for support as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. "That's not possible. Luna Morgana wouldn't lie about something like that." "Wouldn't she?" His voice was gentle, but the words cut like silver blades. "What if keeping you ignorant was the only way to keep you alive? What if the truth about your bloodline was so dangerous that even knowing it could get you killed?" Behind the bars, Fenris released a sound that was half howl, half moan, as if her distress caused him physical pain. The ancient beast pressed himself against the iron bars, straining to reach her with desperate intensity. "I need time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think." Darius nodded slowly, tucking the pendant back inside his jacket. "Time is exactly what we might not have. There are forces moving that have been waiting a very long time for someone like you to emerge. And now that they know you exist, they'll do anything to ensure you don't live long enough to discover who you really are." The words followed her up the stone stairs and into her borrowed room, where she sat on the edge of the too-soft bed and stared out the window at the compound courtyard. Pack members went about their evening routines, but she could see the way they glanced toward her window, the way conversations died when they thought she might be listening. Everything changed when Fenris bowed to her. The question was, had it changed into something wonderful or something that would destroy them all? Elder Tobias hunched over ancient texts in the compound's archive chamber, his weathered fingers tracing symbols that had been old when the oldest living werewolf was born. Dust motes danced in the candlelight as he muttered to himself in the scholar's tongue, occasionally making sharp exclamations when he found passages that confirmed his growing suspicions. Kira stood at his shoulder, trying to make sense of the archaic script that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The parchments smelled of age and secrets, of knowledge that had been deliberately buried beneath layers of lies and convenient forgetting. "Here," Tobias whispered, his gnarled finger stabbing at a particular passage, the silver shadow marking, the royal seal that appears only under the light of the full moon, carried by the true-born heirs of the Shadow Moon dynasty. The old scholar's eyes glittered with excitement as he pulled another tome from the stack beside him, this one bound in leather so old it had turned nearly black. 23 years ago, when the Shadow Moon pack was slaughtered, there were rumours, whispers that the youngest daughter had escaped, hidden away by loyalists who died to protect her identity. Kira's hand drifted unconsciously to her left shoulder, where beneath her simple dress lay a mark she had always assumed was a common birthmark. Crescent-shaped, pale as silver, visible only when moonlight touched her skin directly. She had never thought it significant, had never mentioned it to anyone. "Show me," Tobias commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. With trembling fingers, Kira pulled aside the neckline of her dress, revealing the mark that had been her secret companion for as long as she could remember. In the candlelight it appeared as nothing more than slightly paler skin, unremarkable and easily overlooked. But Tobias sucked in a sharp breath, his eyes widening as if he had seen a ghost. "Bring the moon crystal," he ordered, gesturing toward a shelf lined with various stones and artifacts. The large one, wrapped in silver cloth. Kira retrieved the crystal, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to pulse with inner light. The moment she unwrapped it from its protective covering, her birthmark began to glow with soft silver radiance, the crescent shape becoming unmistakably clear against her skin. "Mother of wolves," Tobias breathed, sinking back in his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "You carry the bloodline of Queen Lyanna herself, the Shadow Moon royal seal unmarked by time or distance." The crystal slipped from Kira's nerveless fingers, clattering to the stone floor as the implications crashed over her like a wave. Royal blood. Not the orphaned daughter of dead rogues, but the lost heir to the most powerful werewolf dynasty in recorded history. "The massacre," she whispered, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. "Luna Morgana said my parents died in a rogue attack, but the Shadow Moon pack was destroyed by their political enemies," Tobias finished grimly. 3 rival alphas who feared the growing power of Queen Lyanna's progressive policies. They struck during the Harvest Moon ceremony when the royal family was most vulnerable. He pulled out another document, this one newer, written in the careful script of official pack records. According to this, every member of the royal line was confirmed dead. King Aldrich, Queen Lyanna, their twin sons Marcus and Damien, and their infant daughter Kira. Her own name, written in the careful hand of whoever had documented the massacre, sent ice through her veins. "But I'm alive." "You're alive because someone loved you enough to die protecting that secret." Tobias's voice gentled as he reached for yet another text, this one written in the flowing script of personal correspondence. "Your nursemaid, Elena, was found 3 days after the massacre, tortured to death, but she never revealed where she had hidden you." The room seemed to spin around her as memories that weren't quite memories flickered through her mind. A woman's voice singing lullabies, strong arms carrying her through moonlit forests, the scent of moonflowers and desperate love. "Elena," she whispered, and the name felt like coming home. "She brought you to Luna Morgana with a story about rogues and mercy, knowing that the lie was the only thing that would keep you safe." Tobias closed the tome with careful reverence. "Morgana may be cruel, but she's not stupid. She understood that harbouring a Shadow Moon heir could bring either incredible power or total destruction to her pack." "So she kept me alive but powerless," Kira said, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. "Made sure I never learned to fight, never learned to lead, never even learned to hope for better treatment." "Suppression magic," Tobias confirmed with a nod toward another shelf lined with bottles and strange implements. "Subtle but effective. Herbs in your food to keep your wolf weak. binding spells woven into your clothing to dampen your natural authority. You've been living under a carefully maintained prison of ignorance and artificial weakness. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the archive chamber. Heavy boots, moving with military precision. Multiple sets, which meant trouble was coming in numbers. "Hide the texts," Kira said urgently, but Tobias was already moving, sliding the most damning documents into a hidden compartment behind the stone wall. The old scholar moved with surprising speed for someone his age, clearly practiced in the art of concealing dangerous knowledge. The door burst open without ceremony, revealing Beta Castor flanked by 4 pack warriors. His scarred face wore an expression of barely controlled rage, and his hand rested on the silver blade at his hip with the casual familiarity of someone who enjoyed using it. "Elder Tobias," Castor said, his voice deceptively polite. "Luna Morgana requests your immediate presence in her private chambers. There are questions about your recent research that require clarification." It was not a request. The warriors stepped into the chamber with practiced coordination, surrounding Tobias before he could protest. But the old scholar's eyes found Kira's across the room, and in them she saw both warning and encouragement. "Of course, Beta," Tobias replied smoothly, rising from his chair with dignity and tact. "I am always happy to share knowledge with those wise enough to seek it." As they escorted him from the chamber, Castor's cold gaze lingered on Kira with obvious suspicion. "You should return to your quarters, Omega. The compound can be dangerous after dark, especially for those who wander where they don't belong." The threat was barely veiled, but Kira managed to nod submissively, playing the role of harmless servant that had kept her alive for 23 years. Only when their footsteps faded into the distance did she allow herself to collapse into Tobias's vacated chair, her entire body trembling with the weight of revelation. She was not nobody. She was not worthless. She was the lost daughter of the most powerful werewolf queen in history, hidden away by love and sacrifice, kept alive by lies that had become her prison. But now that she knew the truth, what was she supposed to do with it? The archive chamber felt suddenly suffocating, filled with the weight of secrets and the lingering scent of fear. Kira gathered the moon crystal that had revealed her true nature, wrapping it carefully in its silver cloth before tucking it inside her dress. The stone's warmth against her chest felt like a talisman, a connection to the mother she had never known and the heritage that had been stolen from her. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the sounds of the compound settling into evening routines. Normal pack members going about normal lives, unaware that their world balanced on the edge of a revelation that would change everything. But change, Kira was beginning to understand, was exactly what Luna Morgana and her allies feared most. They had built their power on the foundation of Shadow Moon's destruction, and the return of the rightful heir threatened to topple everything they had worked to achieve. As she made her way through the darkened corridors toward her quarters, Kira caught glimpses of whispered conversations that stopped when she appeared, of meaningful glances exchanged between pack members who had never bothered to notice her before. Word was spreading, despite all attempts to contain it. The lost princess had been found, and some people were very unhappy about it. In her borrowed room, she stood before the window and let moonlight fall across her bare shoulder, watching as her birthmark blazed with silver fire. For the first time in her life, she looked at her reflection and saw not a mistake or a burden, but a legacy written in starlight and royal blood. The question was whether she would live long enough to claim it. The invitation arrived at dawn, delivered by a servant whose hands shook as she pressed the formal parchment into Kira's palm. The girl couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't seem to decide whether she was delivering an honour or a death sentence. "Luna Morgana requests your presence at the leadership table tonight," the servant whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning sounds of the compound stirring to life. "A formal dinner to discuss your unique circumstances." Kira's fingers tightened on the elegant invitation, noting the way the expensive paper felt smooth as silk against her skin. Everything about it spoke of ceremony and importance, from the deep blue wax seal to the flowing script that spelled out her name with unusual care. Too much care, too much ceremony for someone who had been an Omega servant just days ago. "Tell Luna Morgana I am honoured by her invitation," Kira replied, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. Honour had nothing to do with this. She was being summoned, not invited, and they both knew it. The hours that followed crawled by with agonizing slowness. Kira found herself unable to concentrate on simple tasks, her hands trembling as she attempted to eat breakfast, to read, to do anything that might distract her from the growing certainty that tonight would change everything. She made her way to Fenris's chamber, as she did every day, but even the ancient beast seemed to sense her distress. He pressed himself against the bars with desperate intensity, amber eyes fixed on her face with an expression that looked almost like worry. "They're planning something," she whispered, settling into her usual spot just beyond his reach. "I can feel it in the air, like the pressure before a storm." Fenris released a low whine, the sound vibrating through his massive chest with enough force to make the stone floor beneath her feet tremble. His great head tilted to one side, studying her with that unsettling intelligence that reminded her constantly that he was far more than he appeared to be. "Elder Tobias hasn't returned from his meeting with Luna Morgana," she continued, needing to voice the fears that clawed at her chest. "It's been over 12 hours. That's not a meeting anymore. That's imprisonment." The beast's lips pulled back from his fangs in what could only be described as a snarl, though the sound was directed not at her, but at some invisible threat. As if he could scent the danger that circled her like wolves around wounded prey. Evening arrived with cruel efficiency, and Kira found herself dressed in a gown that had been provided for the occasion. Deep green silk that brought out her eyes, cut in a style that flattered her figure while maintaining the modest neckline, appropriate for pack leadership dinners. Everything about it was perfect, which only made her more suspicious. The great hall had been transformed for the evening, intimate rather than grand. A single table set for 6, positioned near the massive fireplace where dancing flames cast long shadows across the stone walls. Crystal glasses caught the light like captured stars, and silver serving pieces gleamed with the kind of perfection that spoke of special occasions. Luna Morgana rose from her seat at the head of the table as Kira entered, her smile bright and welcoming in a way that made every instinct scream danger. She wore ceremonial robes of midnight blue that emphasized her auburn hair and pale skin, every inch the perfect alpha female. "Kira, my dear," she said warmly, gesturing toward a chair positioned directly to her right. "Please sit. We have so much to discuss." The other attendees were exactly who she had expected. Beta Castor, with his scarred face and cold eyes, Gamma Williams, whose loyalty to Morgana was absolute, Elder Marcus, who served as the pack's official historian, and surprisingly, Alpha King Darius himself. He sat across from her designated chair, his pale blue eyes finding hers the moment she entered the room. Something flickered in his expression when he saw her, gone too quickly to interpret, but it made her stomach flutter with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. "Alpha King," she said, inclining her head in the respectful nod appropriate for royalty. "Just Darius tonight," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like a protective embrace. "We're all friends here, sharing a meal and honest conversation." The lie was so smooth it could have been truth if she hadn't learned to recognize the taste of deception from years of swallowing it. She took her seat with careful grace, noting how the arrangement placed her surrounded by potential enemies, with only Darius as a possible ally. The first courses passed in polite conversation about weather and compound improvements, the kind of meaningless pleasantries that filled uncomfortable silences. But Kira noticed how no one quite met her eyes, how conversation seemed to flow around her rather than including her. It was when the wine was poured that everything changed. The vintage was exquisite, a deep red that caught the firelight like liquid garnets. Luna Morgana raised her glass in what appeared to be a spontaneous toast, her smile bright and genuine. "To new beginnings," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the intimate space. "To the bonds that unite us and the strength we find in truth." Everyone raised their glasses in response, the crystals singing as they touched in a harmony that should have been beautiful. Kira lifted her own glass, noting absently how the wine smelled of dark berries and something else, something bitter that lingered beneath the fruit. She hesitated, the glass halfway to her lips, as instincts honed by 23 years of survival screamed warnings she couldn't quite articulate. Around the table, the others had already drunk deeply, their glasses lowered with satisfied expressions. "Is something wrong, my dear?" Luna Morgana asked, her green eyes sharp with sudden attention. "You seem hesitant." "Nothing's wrong," Kira replied, forcing a smile. "I was just savouring the aroma. It smells wonderful." She brought the glass to her lips and took what appeared to be a healthy swallow, letting the wine touch her tongue before carefully not swallowing. The bitter undertaste was unmistakable now, metallic and wrong, in a way that made her stomach clench with recognition. Poison, subtle and sophisticated, but definitely poison. She managed to keep her expression neutral as she lowered the glass, using her napkin to discreetly spit the wine into the linen while pretending to dab at her mouth. Around the table, conversation resumed, but she could feel the weight of attention focused on her like a physical pressure, waiting. They were all waiting for something. It started as a warmth in her chest, spreading outward through her limbs like honey in her veins. But instead of the weakness and confusion that should have followed the poison's progression, Kira felt something else entirely. Power, raw and ancient, rising from depths she hadn't known existed within her. Her vision sharpened until she could see every detail with crystal clarity. The nervous sweat beading on Beta Castor's forehead, the way Elder Marcus gripped his knife with white knuckles, the sick anticipation in Luna Morgana's green eyes as she waited for the toxin to take effect. But most importantly, she saw the sudden tension in Darius's powerful frame as he realized what was happening. His pale eyes went wide with understanding, then blazed with a fury that made the very air around him seem to shimmer with heat. "How long?" Kira asked conversationally, setting down her wineglass with steady hands. "How long have you been planning to murder me?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to pause in its dancing, as if the entire world held its breath. Luna Morgana's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something predatory and desperate beneath the polished exterior. "I have no idea what you're talking about, my dear. Perhaps you should lie down. You look unwell." "I look unwell because you poisoned my wine," Kira replied, rising from her chair with a fluid grace that surprised everyone present, including herself. "The same way you've been poisoning my food for 23 years, keeping me weak and compliant while you decided what to do with the inconvenient shadow moon air." Power rolled off her in waves now, visible as silver light that danced along her skin like captured starlight. Around the table, the other diners instinctively pressed back in their chairs as something ancient and royal asserted its presence. Beta Castor's hand moved to his silver blade, but before the weapon could clear its sheath, Darius was in motion. His massive form flowed across the table with predatory speed, black wolf erupting from human skin in a transformation so swift it seemed like magic. The impact drove Castor backward, chair and man crashing to the stone floor in a tangle of limbs and snarling fury. Silver blade clattered away across the stones as Darius's jaws locked around the beta's throat, not quite crushing but making his intentions absolutely clear. "The next person who moves against her dies," he snarled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never made empty threats. Around the room, pack loyalty warred with supernatural recognition. Elder Marcus and Gamma Williams remained frozen in their seats, caught between their allegiance to Luna Morgana and the undeniable presence of royal power that filled the air like ozone before lightning. But Luna Morgana herself showed no such hesitation. Her face twisted with 23 years of carefully suppressed rage as she rose from her chair, her own transformation beginning with the distinctive crack of bones reshaping themselves. "You think your bloodline makes you special?" she spat, her voice already deepening with the change. "You think being born royal means you deserve to rule? I've spent decades building this pack's strength, securing alliances that will outlast any single bloodline." Silver light blazed around Kira as her own wolf finally responded to her call. Not the weak, submissive creature she had always believed herself to carry, but something magnificent and terrible, something that had been sleeping under layers of magical suppression for her entire life. "I think," Kira said, her voice carrying harmonics that made every wolf-born creature in the room whimper with involuntary submission, "that you've forgotten who you're talking to." The transformation that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Power flowed through her like molten silver, rewriting every cell, every bone, every breath until she stood revealed as what she had always been meant to be. The lost daughter of Shadow Moon returned at last to claim her birthright. The compound erupted into chaos as Luna Morgana's howl of rage shattered the evening air, calling her loyalists to war. Through the Great Hall's windows, Kira could see pack members pouring into the courtyard, their confusion evident as they tried to understand why their Luna was calling for battle within their own walls. "This way," Darius commanded, his powerful hand grasping her arm as he guided her away from the main corridors. His wolf blazed just beneath his skin, ready to surface at the first sign of threat, and his pale blue eyes scanned every shadow for potential attackers. Behind them, Beta Caster's voice joined Morgana's in a howl that spoke of betrayal and revolution, calling pack members to choose sides in a conflict that would reshape their world. Heavy footsteps thundered through the halls as warriors responded to the summons, their loyalty divided between their sworn Luna and the supernatural authority that radiated from Kira like heat from a forge. "Where are we going?" Kira asked, though she trusted his judgment absolutely. The silver light that danced around her skin cast strange shadows on the stone walls, and she could feel power coursing through her veins like liquid starlight. "The ritual chamber," Darius replied grimly, shouldering open a heavy door that led to parts of the compound she had never seen. "If you're truly Shadow Moon royalty, then there's only one way to fully awaken your abilities before Morgana's forces overwhelm us." The ancient stairs they descended were older than the rest of the compound, carved from living rock and worn smooth by centuries of ceremonial use. The air grew thick with the scent of old magic, of rituals performed and power awakened in the deep places where the earth itself remembered the old ways. Elder Tobias waited for them at the bottom, his weathered face grim but determined. He bore fresh bruises from his captivity, but his eyes blazed with the fervour of someone who had waited his entire life to witness this moment. "The chamber is prepared," he said without preamble, gesturing toward an archway that opened onto a circular room dominated by a massive altar carved from moonstone. "But you must understand, child, once begun, this ritual cannot be stopped. You will emerge either as the true queen of your bloodline, or you will die in the attempt." The ritual chamber took Kira's breath away. Ancient symbols covered every surface, inlaid with silver that caught and reflected light in patterns that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. The moonstone altar rose from the centre of the room like a frozen wave, its surface polished to mirror perfection. But it was the presence that filled the chamber that made her wolf whine with recognition. Not threatening, but ancient beyond measure, as if the very stones remembered every Shadow Moon queen who had undergone this transformation. "What do I need to do?" she asked, stepping toward the altar with careful reverence. "Place your hand on the moonstone and speak the words of awakening," Tobias instructed, pulling a leather-bound tome from his robes. "But know that the ritual will show you everything. Every memory that was taken from you, every power that was suppressed, every moment of your true heritage." Above them, the sounds of battle grew closer. Steel rang against steel, and howls of pain echoed through the ancient stones as pack fought pack in the corridors they had once walked together in peace. Darius positioned himself between her and the chamber's entrance, his massive frame radiating protective tension. "I'll hold them as long as I can," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "But you need to hurry." Kira nodded, placing her palm flat against the cool moonstone. The moment her skin made contact, silver light exploded through the chamber with enough force to drive both men back a step. The ancient symbols blazed to life, and she could feel the awakening beginning like fire in her veins. The first memory hit her like a physical blow, strong arms holding her close, a woman's voice singing lullabies in the old tongue, while starlight streamed through tall windows. Queen Leanna, her mother, beautiful and fierce and desperately in love with the infant daughter she would soon lose. "My little star," the memory whispered, and Kira could feel the phantom touch of gentle fingers stroking her hair. "You are the hope of our people, the light that will guide them home when darkness falls." More memories cascaded through her consciousness. Learning to walk in gardens filled with moonflowers, her twin brothers lifting her onto their shoulders so she could reach the lowest branches of ancient oak trees. King Aldrich teaching her the sacred words that would bind the pack to royal authority, his deep voice patient and loving. But with the beautiful memories came the terrible ones. The night of the massacre, viewed through infant eyes that understood nothing but terror. The scent of blood and smoke, the sounds of her family dying while Eleanor ran through moonlit forests with a crying baby in her arms. Power flowed into her with each recovered memory, abilities that had been locked away since childhood, blazing to life with overwhelming intensity. She could feel every wolf-born creature for miles, their hearts beating in rhythm with hers, their loyalty shifting toward the royal blood that called to something deeper than learned allegiance. The chamber door burst open, revealing Luna Morgana flanked by her most loyal warriors. Her auburn hair was wild with fury, and her green eyes blazed with the desperation of someone watching 23 years of careful planning crumble in a single night. "Stop her!" Morgana screamed, raising a silver blade that gleamed with deadly promise. "Kill the pretender before she can complete the ritual." Darius met the charge with the controlled violence of someone born to warfare, his wolf form erupting from human skin in a transformation so swift it seemed like magic. The first attacker went down with his throat torn out before he could raise his weapon, and the second found himself pinned beneath nearly 300 pounds of furious Alpha King. But there were too many of them, and more flooding through the entrance with every passing second. Silver blades flashed in the moonstone's radiance as Morgana's forces pressed forward with desperate determination. Through the chaos of battle, another presence entered the chamber. Ancient footsteps, heavier than any human tread, accompanied by a presence that made every wolf present pause in involuntary recognition. Fenris had broken free again. The legendary beast filled the chamber entrance like a living mountain, his amber eyes blazing with protective fury as he took in the scene before him. Blood matted his silver-grey fur where he had torn through whatever barriers they had tried to use to contain him, but he moved with the fluid grace of something that had never truly been caged. His roar shook dust from the ancient stones and sent several of Morgana's warriors scrambling backward in terror. But his attention fixed immediately on Kira, still connected to the moonstone altar, as power continued to flow through her in torrents of silver light. "The Guardian," Elder Tobias breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "He's fulfilled his oath. Fenris has returned to protect the Shadow Moon heir." Luna Morgana's face went white with dawning understanding. "Impossible. The Guardian bond was broken when the royal line died. That beast serves no one." "The beast serves the rightful queen," Fenris spoke, his voice like distant thunder, as the ancient magic allowed him speech. "As I have always served, as I will serve until the last star falls dark." The words hit the chamber like a physical force, carrying the weight of oaths sworn before the oldest living wolves had been born. Around the room, Morgana's warriors fell to their knees as supernatural authority crashed over them in waves, their wolves recognizing genetic royalty that could not be denied or defied. But Luna Morgana herself proved more resilient than her followers. With a snarl of pure rage, she launched herself directly at Kira. Silverblade aimed at her heart with killing precision. She never reached her target. Fenris moved with speed that defied his massive size, placing himself between queen and assassin with protective instincts that had been bred into his very bones. The silver blade meant for Kira's heart buried itself instead in the guardian's shoulder, and his howl of pain sent every wolf in the chamber to their bellies in submission. "No!" Kira screamed, her connection to the moonstone altar flaring with emotion so intense it cracked the ancient stone. Power exploded through her in a cascade of silver fire, burning away the last of the suppression magic that had bound her since infancy. When the light faded, she stood transformed, not just physically, though her wolf blazed with the power of her bloodline, but fundamentally changed into what she had always been meant to be. Queen Kira of Shadow Moon, heir to the most powerful werewolf dynasty in recorded history, protector of all wolf-born creatures under her rule. And she was furious. Luna Morgana found herself facing not the submissive Omega she had tormented for over 2 decades, but a queen whose power had been forged in suffering and tempered by justice. Silver light blazed around Kira like armour as she stepped away from the cracked altar, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had finally come home to herself. "You tried to kill me," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber walls themselves tremble. "You murdered my family. You stole 23 years of my life." Around the chamber, every wolf present felt the weight of royal judgment pressing down on them like a physical force. Some of Morgana's warriors began shifting back to human form, their wolves unable to maintain aggression in the face of such overwhelming authority. "I did what was necessary for the pack's survival," Morgana snarled, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Your bloodline was weak. The Shadow Moon dynasty fell because they couldn't adapt to changing times." "My bloodline endured," Kira replied, power making her words ring like struck steel. "Hidden, suppressed, tortured, but never broken, and now it rises again." She gestured, and silver light flowed from her fingers to surround the wounded guardian. Where her power touched him, Fenris's injuries began to heal, the silver blade dissolving like mist before moonlight. The ancient beast rose to his feet with renewed strength, amber eyes fixed on Luna Morgana with predatory intensity. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a sentence that could not be appealed. "The usurper's reign is ended. Long live the true queen." The battle that erupted in the ritual chamber was unlike anything the ancient stones had witnessed in over a century. Silver light blazed from Kira's form as she wielded power that had been sleeping in her bloodline since birth, each gesture sending waves of royal authority that made the very air shimmer with supernatural force. Luna Morgana fought like a creature possessed, her auburn wolf form flowing between shadows with desperate grace as she tried to reach the newly awakened queen. But everywhere she struck, Fenris was there to intercept, the guardian's massive form moving with impossible speed to protect his sworn sovereign. Darius commanded the centre of the chamber with tactical precision, his black wolf form coordinating seamlessly with pack members who had chosen to stand with the rightful queen. Silver rang against silver as loyalties divided along bloodlines older than politics, ancient allegiances awakening in response to royal presence. "You cannot win this," Kira called out, her voice carrying harmonics that made the moonstone altar ring like a struck bell. "Every moment you fight me, more of your people recognize the truth. I am their queen by right of blood and birth." Around the chamber, she could feel it happening. Warriors who had charged in with weapons raised found themselves hesitating as their wolves whined in recognition of genetic authority. The suppression magic that had hidden her true nature for 23 years was gone, leaving her bloodline blazing like a beacon that called to every wolf-born creature within miles. But Luna Morgana's rage burned brighter than supernatural compulsion. "Right of blood!" she snarled, her wolf form bleeding from dozens of minor wounds inflicted by Fenris's protective fury. "Your blood is the blood of weakness. Your parents died because they trusted in genetics instead of strength." She launched herself at Kira again, claws extended for a killing strike, but this time the newly awakened queen was ready. Silver light erupted from her hands in controlled bursts, not to kill, but to bind, weaving nets of pure energy that wrapped around Morgana's wolf form like liquid chains. "My parents died because they trusted the wrong people," Kira replied, her power holding the struggling Luna immobile in mid-air. "They died because they believed honor and loyalty still meant something to wolves like you." The revelation hit like a physical blow, and even Morgana's struggles ceased as the implication sank in. Around the chamber, the remaining warriors went still as understanding dawned in their eyes. "You!" Darius breathed, his wolf form shifting back to human as pieces of a decades-old puzzle clicked into place. "You were one of the conspirators. You helped orchestrate the Shadow Moon massacre." Luna Morgana's bitter laughter echoed off the ancient stones, harsh and broken. "I helped plan it. I helped execute it. And I spent 23 years building power on the foundation of their deaths, waiting for this moment when their precious heir would finally emerge so I could kill her myself." The admission hung in the air like poison, and Kira felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This wasn't just about political power or pack leadership. This was personal. This was revenge that had been fermenting for over 2 decades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Why?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Because I loved him," Morgana spat, her green eyes blazing with old pain and fresh hatred. "Because King Aldrich was supposed to choose me as his queen, not that weak-willed flower who hid behind pretty words and progressive ideals. I was stronger, fiercer, more deserving of the crown that should have been mine." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Luna Morgana hadn't just been a conspirator in the massacre. She had been the architect, driven by jealousy and thwarted ambition to destroy an entire bloodline out of spite. "You murdered children," Kira said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet fury that made experienced warriors take involuntary steps backward. "You slaughtered innocents because you couldn't accept that you weren't chosen." "I eliminated obstacles," Morgana corrected, her struggles against the silver bindings growing weaker as power continued to drain from her. "Your brothers would have grown up to challenge my authority. Your mother would have filled their heads with ideas about mercy and compromise. And you—" She focused her hatred entirely on Kira's face, 23 years of carefully buried guilt and rage pouring out in a torrent of venom. "You were supposed to die in that nursery with the rest of them, but Elena spirited you away before we could finish the job, and by the time we tracked you here, keeping you alive as a powerless servant seemed like a more fitting punishment than a quick death." The chamber fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant echoes of fighting from the upper levels. Every wolf present understood they were witnessing the resolution of a blood debt that had been waiting over 2 decades to be paid. "Choose," Kira said, her silver light pulsing with each word. "Submit to royal justice and accept exile from all pack territories, or face me in combat as the law allows." It was more mercy than Morgana deserved, and everyone present knew it. By rights, the penalty for regicide and conspiracy against royal bloodlines was death, swift and final. But Kira found herself remembering her mother's voice from recovered memories, teaching about justice tempered with wisdom. Luna Morgana's answer came in the form of a concealed silver blade that materialized in her hand as if from nowhere, the weapon sliding free from its hidden sheath with deadly silence. The bindings of silver light couldn't stop steel, and she struck with the desperate speed of someone with nothing left to lose. But she had forgotten about Fenris. The Guardian's massive form intercepted the blade bare inches from Kira's heart, his jaws closing around Morgana's wrist with bone-crushing force. The silver weapon clattered to the stone floor as her scream of pain echoed through the chamber. "Enough," Darius commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had ended too many battles to count. "This ends now." He approached the struggling pair with measured steps, his pale blue eyes reflecting the kind of cold calculation that had made him Alpha King of 3 territories before his 30th birthday. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of royal decree. "Luna Morgana of Moonridge Pack, by your own admission you stand guilty of regicide, conspiracy, and attempted murder of the rightful Shadow Moon Queen. Do you have any final words before sentence is carried out?" Morgana lifted her head with the last of her defiance, blood streaming from where Fenris's fangs had torn her wrist. Her green eyes blazed with unrepentant hatred as she looked at Kira one final time. "You think you've won," she whispered, her voice hoarse with pain. "You think being queen makes you safe, but there are others who remember the old ways, who won't bow to Shadow Moon authority just because genetics say they should. This isn't over." "Yes," Kira said quietly, silver light blazing around her like armour forged from starlight itself. "It is." The power that flowed from her hands was not violent, not cruel, but absolutely final. Silver fire enveloped Luna Morgana's form, not burning but transforming, stripping away the wolf-born nature that had allowed her to challenge royal authority. When the light faded, she collapsed to the stone floor as nothing more than human, her supernatural abilities severed forever. "Exile," Kira pronounced, her voice carrying to every corner of the ancient chamber. "You will leave Packlands within the hour and never return. You will carry no weapons, claim no territory, and hold authority over no wolf-born creature for the remainder of your natural life." It was a fate worse than death for someone who had built their entire identity around supernatural power and dominance. Morgana would live, but as nothing more than a broken human woman haunted by memories of the throne she had tried to steal. As pack members hauled the defeated conspirator from the ritual chamber, Kira felt the last of her royal awakening settle into place. The power that blazed around her was no longer foreign or overwhelming, but simply part of who she had always been meant to be. She was Queen Kira of Shadow Moon, heir to the most powerful werewolf dynasty in recorded history, and for the first time in her life she was exactly where she belonged. But even as victory settled around them like a comfortable cloak, she couldn't shake Morgana's final words. There were others who remembered the old ways, who might not accept Shadow Moon authority simply because genetics demanded it. The civil war was won, but the larger battle for her kingdom was just beginning. The ancient coronation chamber had been sealed for over a century, its doors guarded by magic that recognized only true Shadow Moon blood. But as Kira approached the massive stone portals, carved with symbols older than written language, they swung open with silent reverence, responding to the royal presence that blazed around her like captured starlight. Elder Tobias walked beside her, his weathered hands carrying artifacts that had been hidden since the night of the massacre. The Shadow Moon regalia had waited in secret vaults beneath the compound, protected by loyalists who died rather than reveal their location. Now, finally, they would serve their intended purpose. The crown of Queen Lyanna, Tobias said reverently, lifting a circlet of silver so pure it seemed to glow with inner light. Moonstone and sapphires caught the torch flames, but it was the craftsmanship that took Kira's breath away. Each curve, each setting spoke of artisans who had poured their souls into creating something worthy of their beloved queen. Darius stood at the chamber's heart, no longer just the Alpha King, but something more. His transformation over the past days had been subtle but profound, as if proximity to true royal power had awakened depths in his own bloodline that he hadn't known existed. When he looked at her now, she saw not just desire but recognition, the acknowledgement of an equal. "Are you ready?" he asked, his deep voice echoing off the ancient stones. Kira nodded, though ready seemed inadequate for what she was about to undertake. She was about to claim not just a crown, but the responsibility for every wolf-born creature who would look to her for protection, guidance, and justice. The weight of it should have been crushing, but instead she felt only the rightness of finally becoming who she was always meant to be. The ritual itself was older than memory, each word and gesture passed down through generations of Shadow Moon queens. As Elder Tobias began the ancient chants, Kira felt the presence of her ancestors gathering in the shadows, their approval washing over her like warm moonlight. She knelt before the altar where her mother had once knelt, where her grandmother and great-grandmother had accepted the same burden of leadership. The crown settled onto her head with perfect weight, as if it had been crafted specifically for her brow rather than worn by queens spanning centuries. But it was when the ancient sceptre touched her palm that everything changed. Power flowed through the ceremonial weapon like lightning through silver wire, connecting her not just to her bloodline, but to every wolf pack that had ever sworn allegiance to Shadow Moon authority. She could feel them, scattered across territories she had never seen, their hearts beating in rhythm with hers, thousands upon thousands of wolves, all turning toward her like flowers following the sun, all recognizing, on levels deeper than conscious thought, that their true queen had returned. "Rise, Queen Kira of Shadow Moon," Darius commanded, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Rise and claim your kingdom." When she stood, silver light blazed around her with such intensity that even the ancient stones seemed to sing in harmonious response. The transformation was complete, not just of her appearance, but of her very essence. She was no longer the frightened servant who had cleaned Fenris's cage, but a sovereign whose authority stretched across continents. "I have a proposal for you, Your Majesty," Darius said, dropping to one knee before her with fluid grace, "one that will reshape the werewolf world." The formality of his address sent warmth flooding through her chest, though she could see the heat in his pale blue eyes that spoke of anything but formal distance. "Speak freely, Alpha King. Marry me." The words were simple, but their implications were staggering. Not just as mates, though the bond between us grows stronger with each passing hour. Marry me as a political alliance that will unite every werewolf territory under joint rule. Kira felt her breath catch as the full scope of what he offered became clear. Her Shadow Moon bloodline commanded loyalty through genetic authority, but Darius had earned his position through conquest and tactical brilliance. Together they would rule not just through birthright, but through proven strength. "A merger of our territories would create the first true werewolf empire in over 500 years, she said, understanding flooding through her with crystalline clarity. "Your northern territories combined with Shadow Moon ancestral lands would encompass nearly half the continent," he finished, rising to his feet with predatory grace. "But more than that, it would create stability. No more territorial wars, no more pack fighting pack while humans encroach on our lands. One empire, one law, one purpose." The vision he painted was intoxicating. Centuries of werewolf history had been marked by territorial disputes and fractured leadership, packs rising and falling while their species grew weaker with each generation. But united under joint rule, they could reclaim not just their ancestral strength, but their rightful place in the world. There's something else, Darius continued, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame. Something I should have told you before now. His hand moved to the collar of his shirt, fingers working the buttons with deliberate precision. When he pulled the fabric aside, Kira's breath caught in her throat at what she saw there. A birthmark, crescent-shaped, silver as starlight, identical to the one that marked her own shoulder. The Alpha King bloodline carries Shadow Moon heritage, he said quietly, watching understanding dawn in her silver eyes. My great-grandmother was Lyanna's younger sister, married off to secure alliance with the Northern Pax, the royal blood that calls to you. It calls because we share it. The revelation hit her like lightning, pieces of cosmic puzzle clicking into place with perfect symmetry. Their bond wasn't just supernatural attraction or political convenience. They were kin, separated by generations, but united by blood that remembered its own. Cousins, she breathed, though the word felt inadequate for the complexity of what connected them. Distant enough that the mating is not just acceptable, but ideal, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Close enough that our children will carry the strongest royal bloodline born in 3 centuries. Children. The word sent warmth flooding through her as she imagined cubs with her silver eyes and his commanding presence, heirs who would carry the best of both their bloodlines into an uncertain future. Yes, she said, the word emerging with certainty that surprised them both. Yes, I'll marry you. Not just for politics or bloodlines or empire building. She stepped closer, near enough to see the flecks of gold in his pale eyes, to catch the wild scent that made her wolf purr with contentment. I'll marry you because when I was nothing, you saw something worth protecting. Because when I had no power, you shared yours. Because when I stood alone against enemies who wanted to destroy me, you stood with me. His hands cupped her face with reverent gentleness, thumbs tracing the high cheekbones that marked her as royal born. And I'll marry you because you're the strongest person I've ever met. Because you survived 23 years of cruelty and emerged with your compassion intact. Because you're not just my mate, you're my equal in every way that matters. The kiss that followed was everything their first touch should have been, if circumstances had been different. Fire and starlight, strength and gentleness, the perfect fusion of 2 souls that had been searching for completion without knowing what they sought. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kira could feel the future spreading before them like an uncharted territory full of promise and possibility. So, she said, silver light dancing around them like approval from the ancient powers that govern such things. When do we tell our subjects they're getting married royalty for rulers? Darius's answering grin was sharp enough to cut diamond. How does tomorrow night sound for a wedding, Your Majesty?